Sabres, brand new, just arrived in Korea days early. First American Sabre kill. First hint that someone in Pyongyang made a catastrophic miscalculation about what they were facing. The North Korean command structure, still heavily influenced by Soviet advisors who think they understand air combat, receives the loss report and dismisses it. 1 MiG, operational loss. Happens. Their doctrine, inherited wholesale from Stalin's aviation bureaus, assumes technological parity. 1950. Probably thought his pilots were exaggerating, panicking, making excuses. The reports claim American jets are matching the MiGs' performance, outturning them in sustained combat, killing them at ranges that shouldn't be possible with .50 caliber guns. Impossible. Has to be. By January 1951, the reports are undeniable. MiG-15s are getting shredded, not occasionally, not in bad luck engagement, training deficiencies, cowardice. Some of that's true. North Korean pilots got rushed through training programs that were jokes compared to American standards. But Soviet pilots are dying too. The Americans call the airspace over northwest Korea MiG Alley. North Korean command calls it something else in internal documents, closer to the graveyard. Entire formations vanish. Pilots who survive describe American jets that shouldn't be able to perform the maneuvers they're performing, shouldn't be able to sustain the turn rate. Documents, UN command reports, post-war analysis by aviation historians who cross-referenced every claim they could verify. The kill ratio is 10-1. Some historians argue it's closer to 12-1 if you include probable kills that couldn't be confirmed because wreckage landed in Manchuria. North Korean generals looked at these numbers in 1952 and accused their own pilots of treason. The Soviet advisors in Pyongyang had a different problem. They couldn't blame this on North Korean incompetence anymore because Soviet pilots, actual Red Air Force aces, combat veterans, men who flew in the Great Patriotic War, were getting butchered at almost the same rate. The 64th Fighter Aviation Corps, elite Soviet pilots flying under radio call signs and North Korean markings, lost 335 MiG-15s in air combat. They shot down 345 UN aircraft total. Sounds even, until you realize most of those 345 kills were F-84s, prop jobs, reconnaissance planes, bombers. Against Sabres specifically, slaughtered. Moscow sent furious classified cables demanding explanations. The responses from field commanders are blackly hilarious if you read them now. They blame everything. Pilot inexperience, despite sending aces. Equipment failure, despite the MiG-15 being mechanically sound. Bad weather. Poor visibility. American numerical superiority, which wasn't true in MiG Alley. The Soviets usually had numbers. What they won't admit in official reports, the F-86 is simply better. Here's what makes the 10-1 ratio genuinely shocking. The MiG-15 has real advantages. It climbs faster, higher service ceiling, heavier cannon armament. In a pure vertical fight, MiG-15 should win. Soviet doctrine built entire tactics around that climb rate advantage. Zoom up, dive on Americans, zoom back up before they can react. Didn't work. Americans adapted within weeks. The F-86 has one massive technological edge the Soviets didn't anticipate. The A-4 gunsight. Radar ranging, lead computing, gyroscopic gunsight that calculates deflection automatically. Soviet pilots are still using basic reflector sights, manual lead calculation, eyeball estimation. An American pilot locks onto a target. The A-4 solves the geometry. Pilot squeezes trigger. The 6.50 caliber guns converge exactly where the MiG will be. North Korean command had no idea this technology existed until combat reports mentioned it. By then, hundreds of MiGs were already burning wreckage. The other factor, nobody in Pyongyang wanted to acknowledge. American pilots were volunteers, experienced. Many were World War II veterans. They wanted to be there. Training was exhaustive. Standards were absurd. Meanwhile, North Korean pilots got rushed through programs measured in weeks, not months. Soviet pilots were better, but still operating under doctrine that assumed technological parity. There wasn't parity, there was a chasm. I've read Soviet after-action reports from 1951 where commanders are clearly grasping for explanations that don't admit American superiority. They'll blame individual pilot errors, maintenance issues, radio jamming, sun glare, anything except the obvious conclusion that their aircraft and tactics are obsolete against the F-86. By 1953, the kill ratio is undeniable, even in classified Soviet internal assessments. They stopped sending pilots to Korea. They stopped trying to contest MiG Alley during daylight. The Americans own the sky, and North Korean generals have stopped asking why. The F-86 Sabre has swept wings angled back at 35 degrees. The MiG-15 has swept wings angled back at 35 degrees. Both copied the aerodynamic research from captured German wind tunnel data after World War II. On paper, they should perform identically. They don't. Not even close. North American aviation didn't just slap swept wings onto an airframe and call it finished. They obsessed over every detail. The wing profile, thickness ratio, control surface authority, how the aircraft behaves at transonic speeds, where airflow starts getting weird. They built it for sustained high-speed maneuvering. The MiG-15 was built for simplicity, produced in factories across the USSR, and maintained by conscripts with minimal training. Makes sense from a Soviet industrial standpoint. Pump out thousands of adequate fighters rather than hundreds of perfect ones. Except adequate dies when it meets perfect over MiG Alley. The engine placement is another gap. The F-86 puts the J-47 engine low in the fuselage with the intake in the nose. Clean airflow, predictable thrust response, excellent weight distribution. The MiG-15's Klimov VK-1 engine sits higher with a chin intake that causes airflow disruption during aiming with. The F-86 mounts 6.50 caliber Browning M3 machine guns. Lighter punch, but 1,200 rounds per minute combined fire rate. All 6 guns harmonized to converge at the same point. Flat trajectory out to 1,000 yards. North Korean technical officers examined shot-down Sabres and reported back that American gun installation was inferior. Smaller caliber, less destructive power per hit. Completely missed the point. The F-86 doesn't need to hit as hard because it hits more often. The radar-ranging gunsight turns those .50 cals into precision instruments. By 1952, Soviet aircraft designers were already working on the MiG-17 specifically to address the Sabre's advantages. Too late. The damage was done. MiG Alley belonged to America, and everyone knew it. North Korean command blamed the aircraft first. When that explanation collapsed, they blamed pilot quality. This excuse had more truth to it than they wanted to admit. American Sabre pilots in Korea averaged 1,500 flight hours before they saw combat. Many were World War II veterans who'd already killed Germans or Japanese in the air. The top ace, Joseph McConnell, had 16 confirmed kills. James Jabara got 15. These weren't rookies learning on the job. They were experienced killers flying the best equipment America could build. North Korean pilots got maybe 100 hours total flight time before being thrown into MiG Alley. Some had less. The training program was a joke. Rushed courses that skipped advanced tactics entirely. Focused on basic aircraft operation and survival. They learned to take off, fly straight, land. Dogfighting, energy management, deflection shooting, situational awareness, barely covered. Then they faced men who'd been perfecting those skills for years. The kill per sortie numbers are brutal. Average North Korean pilot lasted maybe 5 combat missions before being shot down or pulling out of MiG Alley rotation permanently. American pilots flew hundreds of missions. The experience gap compounded itself. Americans got better with every engagement, while North Koreans kept feeding fresh, inexperienced meat into the grinder. Soviet pilots were supposed to fix this. Moscow sent combat veterans, instructors from elite units, men with genuine talent and training. They did better than the North Koreans, but better still meant dying at obscene rates against the Sabres. The 64th Fighter Aviation Corps rotated through some of the USSR's best pilots. Evgeny Pepelyayev, genuine ace with 19 kills claimed in Korea. Nikolai Sutyagin with 21 claimed kills. Lev Shchukin, experienced, aggressive, skilled. They fought under strict orders to never speak Russian on radio, use Korean call signs, maintain the fiction that these were North Korean aircraft. Americans knew better. They could tell from the tactics, the discipline, the way these pilots flew. Radio intercepts occasionally caught Russian voices. Didn't matter. Both sides maintained the polite fiction that Soviet pilots weren't officially in Korea. Here's what the Soviets discovered. Their training doctrine was obsolete. Soviet fighter school emphasized formation flying, strict adherence to tactical plans, coordinated attacks. Very rigid, very predictable. Americans trained for individual initiative, fluid tactics, adapting mid-combat. A Soviet four-plane formation would execute a planned attack pattern. Americans would recognize it, counter it, shred them. The defection of No Kum Sok in September 1953 revealed how bad North Korean training really was. He flew his MiG-15 to Kimpo Air Base and handed it over intact. During debriefing, he described training that was essentially criminal negligence, inadequate instruction, political officers who knew nothing about aviation-making decisions, maintenance so poor that aircraft were falling apart. American test pilots flew his MiG afterward. Their assessment: decent aircraft, not great, but absolutely flyable. The problem wasn't the plane. It was everything else. Soviet internal documents from 1952 show commanders were furious about pilot quality, but couldn't fix it fast enough. Training takes time. The Americans had years of institutional knowledge, established programs, veteran instructors. The Soviets were trying to improvise a competitive training pipeline while simultaneously losing experienced pilots over Korea. Pyongyang kept demanding better results. Moscow kept sending better pilots. The F-86 kill ratio barely changed. After a while, Soviet command stopped trying to match the Americans in MiG Alley and focused on keeping North Korean airspace contested at all, which was itself becoming difficult. Pilot quality mattered more than anyone in Pyongyang wanted to admit. They had the aircraft. They had the numbers. They didn't have the men who could use them. American fighter pilots invented combat maneuvers over Korea that Soviet instructors had explicitly taught were impossible. The Sabres' hydraulic controls and superior roll rate let pilots pull maneuvers that violated everything in Soviet tactical doctrine. One favorite, the high G barrel roll defense. MiG on your tail, closing for gun solution. You slam into a rolling climb that bleeds energy while changing your flight path unpredictably. The MiG pilot with manual controls can't follow the roll rate, can't match the G loading, overshoots or loses sight picture. By the time he recovers, you've reversed and you're on his tail. Soviet doctrine said this maneuver was aerodynamically wasteful, sacrificed too much energy, left you vulnerable. In the MiG-15, it did. In the Estently, Americans flew in pairs with constantly shifting roles. Lead and wingman switched dynamically based on who had better position. Soviet four-plane formations were rigid, defined roles, predictable movements. American pairs would split a Soviet formation, force them into individual fights, slaughter them. I've read combat reports where American pilots describe Soviet formations trying the same attack pattern 3 times in one engagement. Same approach angle, same spacing, same execution. Americans countered it the first time, evaded it the second time, murdered them the third time. The Soviets just kept running the playbook. Here's a tactic that North Korean command genuinely couldn't understand: the low-altitude scissors. Two aircraft in close combat, both trying to get guns on each other, flying a series of reversing turns that look like scissors from above. Requires instant control response, high roll rate, precise energy management. The F-86 could do it all day. The MiG-15, with its stiff controls and poor low-speed handling, would fall out of the scissors, lose energy, become a target. American pilots also used their better gun sights to take snapshots. Soviet doctrine considered wasteful. Quick deflection bursts at high crossing angles, low probability hits that Soviet training said to ignore. Except the A4 gun sight made those shots viable. Americans would pump 50 rounds into a crossing MiG and watch it disintegrate. Soviet pilots watching this happen couldn't figure out how the Americans were hitting anything. The vertical reversal at high speed was another American specialty. MiG diving on you, you pull vertical. The MiG follows. You reverse at the top while the MiG is still climbing. He can't match your roll rate, can't reverse as quickly. Suddenly you're above him, dropping down with guns ready. Soviet pilots called this the American trap in radio intercepts and still fell for it constantly. By 1952, American tactics had evolved so far beyond Soviet doctrine that engagements weren't even competitive. North Korean command received reports of MiGs being shot down without landing a single hit on the Sabres. Not because the MiG pilots were cowards, because American pilots were fighting a different kind of air war that Soviet training hadn't prepared anyone for. The Americans were improvising, adapting, inventing. The Soviets were following the manual and dying for it. Moscow decided to fix the embarrassment by sending their absolute best pilots to Korea. Elite instructors, aces from the Great Patriotic War, men who'd survived hundreds of combat missions against the Luftwaffe. If North Korean pilots were inadequate and regular Soviet units were struggling, the solution was obvious: send the legends. It didn't work. The Americans killed them even faster. Captain Dmitry Oskin arrived in Korea in early 1952 as part of a special rotation of experienced Soviet aviators tasked with restoring air superiority over the Yalu. Oskin had 23 confirmed kills against German aircraft. He'd survived Stalingrad, Kursk, the drive to Berlin. He lasted 3 weeks in MiG Alley before an F-86 pilot named Harold Fisher shot him down. Oskin ejected, survived, went home. Never flew combat again. The problem wasn't courage or experience. The problem was that fighting Germans in 1943 wasn't the same as fighting Americans in 1952. Luftwaffe pilots in the late war were increasingly inexperienced, flying inferior aircraft, short on fuel and ammunition. American Sabre pilots were well supplied, well trained, flying superior equipment, and hunting MiGs with industrial efficiency. Soviet ace instructors arrived expecting to teach North Korean and Chinese pilots how to beat the Americans. Instead, they discovered that their own tactical knowledge was obsolete. The combat environment had evolved past their experience base. High-speed jet combat at transonic speeds required different instincts, different energy management, different split-second decisions than propeller-driven dogfights over Eastern Europe. Several Soviet aces publicly claimed kills against Sabres that American records don't confirm. Evgeny Pepelyaev claimed 19 victories. Americans acknowledge maybe 6. This wasn't necessarily lying. Combat is chaotic. Claiming a kill based on seeing an aircraft trailing smoke doesn't mean it crashed. But the discrepancy reveals how badly Soviet pilots were overestimating their effectiveness. Meanwhile, American aces were racking up confirmed kills with multiple witnesses, gun camera footage, wreckage verification. Joseph McConnell got his 16th kill in May 1953, watched the MiG-15 explode, had 3 other Sabre pilots confirm it, had gun camera footage showing the kill sequence. No ambiguity. The Soviet expert pilots also discovered their equipment limitations in ways that shocked them. Against the Luftwaffe in 1944, Soviet aircraft were often inferior but sufficient. Against the F-86 in 1952, the MiG-15's deficiencies were lethal. These aces had spent years learning to compensate for aircraft weaknesses. The Sabre didn't let them compensate. There's a Soviet after-action report from late 1952, still classified until the 1990s, where a regimental commander admits that sending experienced pilots to Korea is pointless if they're flying inferior tactics in inferior aircraft against superior opponents. He recommends either matching American technology and training or withdrawing from MiG Alley entirely. Moscow ignored him. North Korean command kept requesting more Soviet help. Moscow kept rotating in new units, new pilots, new aces. The kill ratio didn't change. If anything, it got worse because American pilots were also getting better, accumulating experience, refining tactics that worked against Soviet doctrine. By mid-1953, some of the USSR's best combat pilots had been through Korea and come back with a new respect for American aviation that bordered on fear. They'd gone in confident and come out knowing they'd faced opponents who were simply better trained, better equipped, better led. The Americans weren't just winning. They were teaching the Soviets a lesson about modern air combat that Moscow spent the next decade trying to absorb. Sending experts didn't help because the Americans had already redefined what expertise meant. North Korean propaganda claimed total air superiority throughout the war. Radio Pyongyang announced hundreds of American aircraft destroyed monthly. State newspapers published heroic accounts of MiG pilots slaughtering entire formations of imperialist jets. Kim Il-sung personally decorated pilots for victories that never happened. Meanwhile, actual Soviet pilots were writing letters home, describing apocalyptic losses. The propaganda machine had to maintain the fiction that North Korea was winning. Admitting the truth, that American fighters were dominating the sky so completely that daylight bombing missions over the North went almost unopposed, would undermine the entire war narrative. So they lied, elaborately, constantly. Internal Soviet military documents tell a different story. Classified loss reports show entire squadrons effectively destroyed within weeks of deployment. Pilots who survived MiG Alley rotations wrote candid assessments that never made it into official channels. One letter intercepted by Western intelligence described watching 12 MiG-15s engage 4 F-86s and losing 8 MiGs without scratching a single Sabre. The Chinese People's Volunteer Air Force contributed their own fictional victories. They claimed 330 UN aircraft destroyed in air combat. Actual verified Chinese kills against F-86s, maybe 20. The rest were transports, reconnaissance planes, prop aircraft, or complete fabrications. Chinese propaganda couldn't admit their pilots were being slaughtered by Americans flying better equipment with better training. North Korean command faced an impossible problem. They needed to maintain morale, justify continued Soviet support, convince their own leadership that victory was achievable. So combat reports became creative writing exercises. Pilots who'd barely escaped with their lives filed claims of multiple kills. Units that lost half their aircraft in a single engagement reported overwhelming victories. Some of this was self-preservation. Admitting defeat meant being accused of cowardice or incompetence. Soviet advisors weren't sympathetic to pilots who came back empty-handed. Easier to claim you shot down 2 Sabres than admit you fled after watching your wingman explode. The Americans knew the propaganda was garbage. They had gun camera footage, wreckage analysis, their own loss records. When Pyongyang claimed shooting down 50 American jets in a week, the Americans knew they'd lost maybe 3. The discrepancy was so absurd it became darkly funny. What broke the propaganda machine wasn't Western pressure or internal dissent. It was the pilots themselves stopping belief in their own lies. By 1952, Soviet air crews in Korea knew the real situation. They'd watched too many friends die, survived too many one-sided engagements, seen too much evidence that the Americans owned MiG Alley. Radio intercepts from late 1952 show Soviet pilots warning each other about Sabre formations using coded language that clearly indicated fear. They're not calling them enemy aircraft or using tactical designations. They're calling them the hunters and discussing avoidance tactics rather than engagement strategies. North Korean command kept publishing victory claims right through the armistice. The final propaganda tally claimed over 1,200 American aircraft destroyed in air combat. Actual American losses to MiGs, 78 Sabres plus maybe another 100 other aircraft types. Even generously counting every UN aircraft lost to any cause, the propaganda numbers were fantasy. Soviet records declassified in the 1990s revealed what Moscow actually knew. They had accurate loss figures. They knew the kill ratio. They knew their aircraft and tactics were inferior. They continued supporting the propaganda anyway, because admitting the truth meant admitting American technological and tactical superiority. The lies couldn't change what happened in the sky over Northwest Korea. 792 MiGs destroyed. The numbers were real, even if Pyongyang refused to acknowledge them. The Korean War ended in July 1953, with an armistice that changed nothing politically and everything militarily. North Korea survived. The border stayed roughly where it started. Both sides claimed victory. But in the sky, the question was settled permanently. The F-86 versus MiG-15 engagement proved that American aviation had evolved past Soviet capabilities in ways that couldn't be fixed by throwing more aircraft or more pilots into the fight. This wasn't a temporary advantage or a tactical quirk. This was systematic superiority across technology, training, doctrine, and execution. Soviet aircraft designers spent the rest of the 1950s trying to catch up. The MiG-17 incorporated lessons from Korea: better low-altitude performance, improved controls, more reliable engines. Still not enough. The superiority doctrine became the foundation for every conflict afterward. The idea that you establish complete control of the sky before doing anything else, that you hunt and kill enemy fighters until they stop contesting airspace, that technological advantage plus superior training equals dominance. Korea proved all of it. North Korean leadership never publicly acknowledged the defeat in the air. To this day, official North Korean history claims their pilots won the aerial war. The museum in Pyongyang displays wreckage from shot-down American aircraft alongside fabricated kill counts. Guides tell tourists about heroic MiG pilots destroying imperialist jets by the dozen. The Soviets were more honest in classified assessments. Internal military reviews from the mid-1950s explicitly state that Soviet aviation failed in Korea due to inferior technology, inadequate training, and rigid tactical doctrine. They started reforming pilot training programs, investing in new aircraft designs, studying American tactics. China drew similar conclusions. Their air force got eviscerated over Korea, and they knew it. Post-war Chinese military academies taught the Korean Air War as a cautionary tale about what happens when you face a technologically superior opponent with better trained pilots. The kill ratio, 10-1 conservatively, became the benchmark everyone measured against. Modern air forces use it as the standard for air superiority. If you can't achieve something close to the Sabres' performance over MiG Alley, you don't have air dominance, you have a contested environment. American Sabre pilots came home to parades and medals. Joseph McConnell became a national hero. The F-86 became legendary, the gold standard of Cold War jet fighters. North American aviation built over 9,000 Sabres in various versions. The aircraft served in air forces worldwide for decades. The MiG-15 stayed in service too, mostly in second